let's do the next part of this 3.1 where we're going to handle the functions of the handleFormSubmit and the handleClear function. So I already have this copied. I actually don't have it copied yet into here. Okay, so all the work we're going to do is in these two functions for today, for this step. And it's a really important step. So let's actually talk about it just for a second, okay? Let me refresh my code because I've been playing with it a little bit here. Cool, and let me take off my breakpoint because we will no longer need it or not need it for this first step. So one of the things I want to show you is something that you may have noticed before that I haven't talked about, is that when you hit, well, we talked about this. When you click the calculate footprint, you submit the form, okay? The event listener is waiting, listening, and when you actually submit it, right? Not only does it go away so quickly you don't see it, we know because we set that breakpoint that it is going to this function. It's calling this function, but nothing it's getting cleared, it seems, somehow. But there's another thing is if you go up to the URL after you've hit submit, you actually will see some additional content up here, and these are query strings. And this is because it's the form in JavaScript, in HTML, actually has a default behavior that it thinks it's going to send it to some server. And so what it's doing here is trying to pass some of the values, which we don't want it to do this in our case. And actually, in many cases, we don't want to for other reasons. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that just so it's not there. Okay, but that default behavior is what we need to get rid of. Okay, so over here in our comments, let's go ahead and put this in here, which is right above here. We're actually going to have a parameter. So remember I talked about arguments and parameters. And when I talked about the handleFormSubmit, I said this was a callback function, and we don't have an argument to pass into this function, but this function is called by the browser, and it actually does have something it passes. We don't handle that. The browser does, but we can use it. And so what we can do here is we can actually put event here. Now I'm naming this event. You can name this anything. You may also, this is kind of standard what you see, but you could also see it just E, right? But I think event, especially for students who are new to this, might be a little more helpful. So this says you have a parameter coming into this function, right? The event object, and it is an object, and we're actually going to talk about objects on the next one, but it is provided by the browser. Okay, so you might think, boy, I bet knowing Rio so far, she's going to go ahead and log that so we can look at it. Well, I'd love to, but what will happen is if I log this here, right, what will happen is what we already see, which is that it appears to just disappear, whatever's happening in here. And it's not just disappearing, it's trying to, what I said before, was do its default behavior. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what, before you do this, let me just undo that. Before you actually look at the event, okay, let's call that argument and call a method. Now this method term is something that you'll hear again and again, but it's basically just a built-in function somewhere that's part of the larger code base. So in this case we'll say prevent default. Okay, so that we are calling. Now we don't have this function in our code. It's built in. We're calling something that's built into the ecosystem that is the browser and JavaScript. Okay, but by doing that, then we stop that default behavior, and then we can look at what that event is, and then do some other coding related to what we want. So let's actually see this now in action. So now if I come down here, right, I can hit now submit, right, which by the way I should have maybe not the first time put a breakpoint so you could have seen it go all the way through, but notice we have something new on the console. And again, you really need to be following along and looking at these things because it helps you start to understand what's happening. So if I drop this down, notice there's a little arrow there. This is all the things the browser passed to us, right? It gave us an argument. We now have a parameter called event, and now we can call a method, a function on that to prevent default behavior, okay? And we can look at the event now. So instead of it just going away, and notice our URL, you'll see it in a minute, will also now be different. It'll be what we would expect. But now we can look at this event. Now we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but we will definitely revisit this in the future because there's going to be some things we're going to want to reference, but you can already see some things you may recognize down in here. And by the way, timestamp. It knows exactly. So there's so much we'd want to know, right? Default prevented. Look at this, default prevented. It's true, right? If we could have outputted that somewhere to look at it, we would have seen before we included this, it was false. Okay, I think there's some more content we need. Yeah. So let's actually grab this. Oh, actually I didn't actually let it continue walking through. So let's just actually do that and let it finish. Good, there we go. And now we can see the form was submitted. Okay, and up here we can see that the URL now is back to what we have probably normally expected to see. Okay, so I'm going to grab this. I'm going to say here, right? This is right here. Right? So this is important, prevent default behavior. And this is what default behavior, what it does for us, right? This stops the browser's default behavior of reloading the page when the form is submitted. And again, this is based on the idea that when building the coding up, when building the base code for this, it assumed there was a server out there and we were sending it to a server, which is not a bad assumption, but now we handle that in other ways. So maybe over time they'll actually change this to naturally be prevent default behavior. Okay, all right, so that's great. Now we have some preventing we can look at the event, we know we're passing it in, right? And in this case, it actually, I'll just give you a little foreshadowing, it actually happens also on the handleClearForm, but we just don't need to prevent its default behavior because it's a button click versus a form submission, okay? Just FYI. Okay, so now let's actually look at what we came here to do. Well, what we came here to do was actually to set up, say, const household members. This is a variable we're going to set up inside of this block scope. Okay, and what is it going to be? Well, it's going to be, because we already have a reference to the input, so we could say household members input, right? And if we just left it like that for a minute, without doing it, what would be in here? Well, it'd be whatever we already had defined up here, which is the whole input, the whole HTML input. But we don't want just that. We want its what? Right? So let's actually just look at it. Let me do it here. Stop the form submission there. Okay? Or stop the function. So now we know we have this input which references, okay, let me go back up here so you can see it, right? So we know that's the input, right? We know that's the whole input, but what we want is a particular part of the input, which is its value. And right now it's 1, right? So there's a great thing we can do, which is right here. Let's just do this here. If we add at the end of this dot value, then we're going to get back that's value. So it's going to look at the reference, which is the reference we've already set up, and it's saying, hey, give me the value, and whatever that is, then store it in this variable. Okay? So now, and you probably aren't going to be surprised, and actually let's just do it here. Let's actually change this to a template string, okay? Form submitted. And we'll kind of, and we'll imbibe this with a little more content here. So let's say, right, household members. And we could even say form submitted with household members of, okay, cool. So now we come back here. Let's let this run, okay. And I don't even need to stop it now because now it's going to come, and actually I am going to stop it. You'll see why in a minute, okay? So if I hit submit, cool, we're here, right? When I execute this line, then I see that's, but interestingly enough, if you can see this, and if not, you should be doing it on yours to see this, is that there's quotes around the 1. Well, what does that mean, right? From a data type perspective, that means it's a string. Well, in this case, we know we're going to need this to be a number. Now, you might say, Rio, I don't know that. Well, this is what I'm telling you. Eventually, we're going to need this as a number. And right now, it's a string. You might wonder, well, why is it a string? And the answer is the way the HTML, the inputs handle it, they default to strings, and you in your code need to actually tell it what data type you want it to be. Now, JavaScript is helpful. It'll actually convert that, try to convert it for you if you were doing math, kind of like what we saw before in when we were looking at data types. But there's a way we can actually force it. But before we do that, just to show you this, right? So right now, if I was to do console.log household members, but I said something we've already learned, hey, what's the data type of that, right? So actually think about this. It actually wouldn't be until here. Now, why would that be true? Because I haven't run that code, so I need to go after it now that I've defined that variable value here is now, right? It'll show me what it is. Now, I already kind of know, but type of will actually clearly help me see what that is. Okay, so let's do this again. And let's go ahead and let it run. Let's just let it run completely. And now it says it's a string. So when, by the way, remember here, if you can click and it'll take you right back to where that output came from in your JavaScript. So it shows us it's a string, and we're like, well, we don't want a string, we want a number, so what do? Right? So there's something really cool we can do, something fairly simple we can do, and it's called parseInt. Okay? So now what we can do is come up here, and there's a couple ways we could do this. But there's a built-in JavaScript method called parseInt. And what we're going to do is wrap this in parentheses, maybe. And what this is going to do is this is going to be an argument that's passed to this method, and what gets returned will be the string, the number type, data type number from whatever was in this value. Okay, so now our type of should be what, right? So let's actually go ahead and come down here. And now I should actually take this off, but okay. So now it's number. So by running parseInt, that gave us the number, which is what we wanted. Okay, so really, really helpful here to be able to do that. So for now, we're just go ahead and, you know, leave that the way it is. And I've already put, did I do parseInt to the oh, I didn't. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this in. So the other thing that we need to think about, so that's the parseInt, so the dot value and the dot parseInt and what they're doing. So in this case, there's another thing we want to actually, I shouldn't get rid of it. There's another thing we want to think about, right? Because often, and actually kind of in a way of showing you this, let's come up here and let's say just 2 instead of 1, right? So in this case, when we hit submit, then we get whatever that updated value is. So what happens if we put nothing, right? By the way, notice the HTML, the way it's written, actually does have kind of what we think of as a default value, but notice myself as the user can change that. So if I now do calculate, it's not a number. It's like, wait a minute, and this is the thing, you have to assume that users, which we are all users, do the wrong thing, and just by accident had deleted that. And what it would do is your code, when it goes to calculate the carbon footprint points related to this input, would break. So what we're going to do, and this is really helpful to do, and let's go ahead and put this in here, right? Is here, what we can do is we can say or, okay? So it could be that or 1. So if this, and so the or one. And this, when you see this, and we call these two pipes, right? Or there's a, but this is an operator and it's an or operator, and you're going to get introduced to ands and ors in more formal ways later. But for now, it basically says if the input is empty or invalid, which not a number was, then it defaults. It says, hey, if this, right? If this is empty or invalid, which not a number was, then make that 1. So in that case, just writing that very small addition of the or, right? And let's just do this again now. Okay, come down here and let's see it. Oh, did I? Okay, so now it actually set it to 1, even though we know we cleared out that input. So what we can see is that it evaluated this parse input, and we saw before it was not an NaN is not a number, and it said, oh, okay, then I'm going to set it to 1. So either it's this value, if it's a valid value, or it's 1. So it's a way of just safeguarding, and this is very common in programming. You're trying to make sure, because the user will do the wrong thing, you pretty much have to assume. Now we've already done this part, right? So let's actually just make sure of this right here, where we are logging the collected data to the console. Okay. So now let's just, and this won't take very long. So most of the work had to be done right here in the handle form submission, because inside of the clear there's really only about 2 things we're going to do. Okay, so one thing is we're going to, and I'll just go ahead and copy this in, right? So what we have to, what do we want to do? So here on the clear form is, let's say the user was entering a number, right? What we'd want to do is, or maybe they submitted it already and we just want to clear it. Sometimes on submit we can clear the form. That's kind of good practice sometimes, but we want to give the user the ability to clear it if for some reason, especially on maybe a long form, we'd want that cleared. Okay, so what we can do is actually use the carbon footprint form, right? So that reference we have to the DOM out in global, and we can just say reset. Oh, I had this happen before. Reset, I did space and came back to do it. And that auto, what we call autocomplete or IntelliSense, sometimes gets in the way. All right, so what does this do? Well, you're actually going to see it in action. So let's go up here and let's say, right, does it have, yeah, it has the code. Okay, so let's actually go right here. Okay, so if I come down here, right, and in this case, it's going to do anything because it's going to reset the entire form. All this was doing was handling the one input. So we'll talk about that in a minute, right? So if I did all this and I said clear, right? So at this point, notice already, it cleared everything back to its default, its built-in browser of whatever we have in the HTML has now been reset to those values. Okay, so that's what that reset gave us, and then we said, hey, your clear button was clicked. But we're actually going to do another step here. Oh, by the way, this is actually the other line that you want with this, which is not only is it reset all to the back to the initial values defined in the HTML. So remember, you can always go in here and see what those values are, right? So it's value here, and look, it's a string. Right? It is a string value in here. And you might think, well, we can just change that to a number. You can't really. And this is why we have to write JavaScript to handle that. So the last step we're going to do on this one is actually we're going to do one more thing. Again, it's kind of an edge case. It's like, what happens if for some reason, you know, somebody's trying to mess with our form and they didn't actually do you know, they were messing with it, and we want to make sure we have not only reset it, but set those default values. So what you can do here is you can say household members dot input, its value, okay, is going to be equal to 1. Okay, so not only have you reset it, but you've also, so this is kind of just a checkpoint, like let's just make sure. So manually, and what you're learning here is like why you have to really not just handle, you know, the standard functionality, but you also have to think about all the ways things could go wrong and code for that as well. And that's what this line does. And it's not that you really can see it. I mean, you know, if I put again 1,000, but I hit the clear, we know that that clear has already, let's see where did it stop at. Oh yeah, so it's right on that line, so it actually hasn't, now it has cleared it. And now it's like, okay, I'm just going to also do this step, and it may seem like it's an unnecessary step, but it's actually not. For a lot of different reasons, which we won't go over. So here's the prompts you want to check out. Okay, explain the purpose of prevent default behavior. And specifically, now we've talked about it, but you just want to learn more. Describe parseInt and the OR operator together to safely process the user input. Compare and contrast the form reset and manual inputs of the values and how they affect forms, right? And then research the object. All right, so this one is going to be something foreshadowing where we're heading, right? Because we haven't talked about objects yet, and these are data structures that we will do. So the last thing you want to do is do your Git workflow, and there's your commit message. I'll see you on the next one.